So much for joining the Resistance Bureau today. This is our fourth show in 2021, and I'm very excited to be joining you again as your host. My name is Mandata Mlojwa, and I'm joined today by my colleague, Jeffrey Smith. Jeffrey, how are you today?
Good. How are you?
I'm great, thank you. So basically, the Resistance Bureau focuses on critical issues affecting Africa, including human rights, democracy, and the struggle for freedom. It's a program that spotlights some of the leaders that are at the forefront of this ongoing fight and basically seeks to build solidarity among them by providing a space for sharing ideas, networking, as well as just providing that platform to elevate their voices. In that spirit, we're joined today by some of Africa's prominent speakers who are helping us to unpack the topic. The myth of the benevolent dictator, does Africa need strong men to prosper? Our speakers today include Sedali Lema, an Ethiopian journalist who has long been at the forefront of the promotion of democratic values in often very difficult circumstances. We also have Tutu Alicante, a human rights lawyer and anti-corruption campaigner from Equatorial Guinea, which is home to Africa's longest serving president. And Nancy O'Kale, an Egyptian scholar who is legendary for defiance and bravery during that country's 2011 revolution. Also joining us today as a discussant is Brian Klaas, a best-selling author of several acclaimed books on democracy and authoritarianism. Certainly fertile ground for the discussion today. He's also joined by our colleague Nick Chisman, who will be joining us at the public Q&A towards the end of the program. For those that are interested in the more biographical details of the participants today, we'll be sharing that later today as we progress through the show. But thank you so much to the speakers for joining us. Thank you so much, Brian and Nick. It's a pleasure to see you. So for today's program, if you want to join the conversation, you can follow us on Twitter by following @Resist Bureau as well as using the hashtag Resist Bureau Live. We're currently live streaming on Facebook as well as on YouTube, and this show is being recorded for later distribution. I'll now just jump over to Jeff to give an introduction of the topic.
Thank you so much, Mantade, and thanks to everyone who has joined us today, including our many first-time viewers. I understand there are quite a few of you. Our team and our speakers are live right now from several different continents and time zones, which is a great challenge to be sure, but also, I think, a real testament to the show's global reach and impact. It is often said that Africa is not ready for democracy, and that what African states really need are so-called benevolent dictators, strong men who can maintain public order, most often by crushing political rights and civil liberties, while making the argument that such moves are needed to drive economic development. On our last program, Tanzanian lawyer Fatma Karume argued that this line of thought is predicated on racist notions of African inferiority, but it nonetheless continues to hold sway with many influential audiences. This is partly because democracy, or what masquerades as democracy, has struggled in a number of countries. But it is also underpinned by the assumption that order and efficiency may be easier to achieve under authoritarian rule, or that development is best achieved with technocrats as opposed to democracy advocates, as if these two categories are somehow mutually exclusive. The seemingly impressive performance of Rwanda and economic growth and stability of its political elite, as one example, is often cited as evidence that democracy is a dangerous distraction that the continent writ large can ill afford. Ethiopia too, and to a certain extent Tanzania, have also been included in these discussions, though certainly less so after events of the past few months. What is more, quantitative analysis suggests that these countries are the exception rather than the rule, both in Africa and worldwide. For instance, recent research by the Africa Center on Strategic Studies has found that a majority of the continent's 16 autocracies are currently experiencing armed conflict. None of Africa's democracies, by comparison, are experiencing the same. Research has also found that Africa's record levels of displacement, as well as food insecurity, are also inherently linked to authoritarian governance, as opposed to their democratic or democratizing counterparts. And of course, let's be honest, very few of the authoritarian leaders that the world has ever produced have been in any way benevolent. In reality, then, is the benevolent dictator an oxymoron? Is the notion of a strongman leader really just a contradiction of terms? This show will seek to answer these questions and more by learning from the expertise and insights of those who have firsthand experience, those we have assembled today. And of course, from what all of you in the audience think about these critical and timely issues. Have your say by sending us a note on our WhatsApp, +263 77 623 8199. We definitely have a lot of issues to unpack and to explore today. So Mantade, my co-host, what do you think? Shall we get started?
Totally. Thank you so much, Jeff. So Nancy, I'll just jump straight to you to kind of set the foundation for the discussion today, because you've written and spoken very eloquently around your experiences in Egypt. the ruler of which the former president of the United States, Donald Trump, referred to as his favorite dictator. Simply put, does dictatorship lead to prosperity and stability? And if it actually does, prosperity and stability for who?
Right. Thank you all so much. And thank you, Jeff, for organizing this panel. I'm really honored to be joining you all, like with your expertise and knowledge and views in activism for democracy and freedom. I think if we just to start, it is very sad that at this day and age, we have to ask this question about do we need a strong man? I think to address this, I would address it in three different perspectives. One is the political morality one very briefly, and then the interpretation of what this means, and then the functionality of the benevolent dictator, both domestically and international relations. So to start with, the idea of the benevolent dictator is highly problematic when we see it only directed into the South, into Africa. We don't see people asking about the benevolent dictator, about, for example, when we see leaders such as Viktor Orban in Hungary. It's like whether this is good for Hungary or not. It's usually directed to the African country or the South, and it's problematic because it undermines the agency of the people. And that brings me to the issue of the essentialization of the people in Africa, or the people who are living under these circumstances, and what they actually want rather than what we see is useful or right. And then the second side of the coin of this is the issue of the question that we have to be honest with ourselves: is benevolent to whom? Because there is a pretense that the benevolent dictator is benevolent for everyone. But whenever this term is spelled out, it's usually seen as benevolent to the West, benevolent to making sure that there will be no problem, that the issues will be contained, whether we're talking about radicalization or violent conflict, as long as this is contained within the country, this dictator could be seen as benevolent. Or for Trump, regarding Sisi, is his favorite dictator. So this is an important issue that we need to just set at the outset, and just be honest with ourselves what we mean when we say a benevolent dictator, and benevolent to whom. The second part is about the interpretation. People use a strong man and a strong government synonymously, and that's problematic as well. A violent, repressive regime is not a strong regime. A repressive government is not a strong state. It's actually the opposite. First of all, repressive behavior, just as we see in so many countries under the leadership of a dictator, that we see extrajudicial killing, we see imprisonment, repressive policies. All these are not a sign of strong government. Actually, in fact, it's the opposite. It's a sign of vulnerability. It's the need for those regimes to go into extreme measures to protect themselves. So this debunking this myth that a benevolent dictator, or a dictator, using the crackdown, the strong grip, and the repressive policies is a reflection of a stable government is a myth. I mean, there's a joke, Hillary Clinton on February 2nd, 2011, tweeted saying Egypt is the most stable country in the region. And just a few days later, Mubarak just was ousted. So there's this myth about the difference between a strong government and a strong man. And this has a reflection on how governance operates. When we talk about the governance structure, strong governance means strong institutions, means that there's an effort and resources and a deliberate political will to strengthen the judicial institutions, parliament, the cabinet, the executive branch. But under the strongman or under the dictatorship, this is actually the opposite. There's an erosion of the institutions because of the fear of control. And actually, if we look at SDG 16, or like the Sustainable Development Goals, like for 2030, SDG 16 is actually about peace, justice, and strong institution. And there's a reason why those three are put together, because without strong institution, you don't have justice and you don't have peace. So that's one. Now come to the heart of the matter, like leaving the interpretation and going into the functionality of a government operating under dictatorship. I mean, it's problematic on both sides, both domestically and internationally. Well, domestically, a dictator usually or mostly have a legitimacy crisis. And that legitimacy crisis has implications over how to rule. And the most common approach for such governance is depending on two things. First of all, loyalists, as opposed to competent actors who join the government and have like a real impact that is positive on the entire country or the state. And the second thing is that favoring security or the hyper securitization of the mode of governance. And this is problematic not just for the country. Of course, it's obvious. I mean, doesn't need to go into like further interpretation why relying on loyalists and instead of like the merit and competence of people and the security, because it's obvious, like the repression of people, the imprisonment, the suppression of the press, extrajudicial killing, and all this. But it's even harmful for like, if we look at it, unfortunately, from a very specific self-interest of the dictator maintaining their spot. Because when you are relying on loyalists and you are relying on the security apparatus, you always need to pay those people off. And in order to have enough resources to pay those people off, you technically have to have a strong economy. And if you don't have that, and if you don't have a real sustainable, strong institution to produce that, that means that you will always fall short on being able to pay off your loyalists and the security apparatus. And that leads you to even more violence, and that leads to your vulnerability. And that's why we always see like there is like a very strong correlation between dictatorship and violence of the state. Now, I don't want to like go over my time, but this is domestically. But if we also look at it internationally, it's basically, if we're honest with ourselves and we're talking about the benevolent dictator, it's basically for the international community, it's the devil we know. It's preferring that someone we can talk to, control things, and we have leverage over. And again, this is a myth, because we've seen in so many ways, first of all, as I said, like in terms of interpretation, those leaders are not as stable as we think. I mean, we've seen Mubarak, for example, with a huge, security apparatus and intelligence. I mean, like at the time, like of his last 10 years of Mubarak's reign, it was like the security apparatus has like grown massively in terms of numbers and resources and might and influence. Yet in 18 days, he was deposed. And on the other hand, it's also the idea of having influence and leverage and the support of dictatorship for the sake of having a say or a seat on the table to influence the direction of things. And I would give you just like a small, maybe personal example. When in 2011, the Egyptian government decided to prosecute 43 NGO workers, including myself, of 5 organizations, and indicting 17 Americans of the 43, the US could not do a thing. They could not do anything. They could not even, like with the US giving $1.3 billion in military aid to Egypt, yet they could not prevent this. They could not even push for like a lighter sentence. And I personally was sentenced to 5 years in prison because of that. And in that case, you are only as powerful as your ability to use your leverage, not what you actually think the leverage is. So if you think that by supporting a dictator with $1.3 billion, that would actually create an impression that you have some leverage, this is also another myth, because you are only as strong as your ability to use this leverage. And dictators know this very well. And they continue to play that card over and again, playing within that myth. And again, like, honesty is very important, that we just name things by their names, by like the politics of containment is not something that is called benevolent. If we look even like away from the US, we look at the EU policies, the number of investment in border control has tripled in the past 5 years. And that's again a reflection that instead of addressing the roots of the problems in the countries that are suffering from these conditions and repressive regimes, they would actually choose to increase border control to just contain the problem and prevent the spillover. So that's basically how I see the framing, like through those 3 points. And I look forward to the conversation with you all.
Thank you so much, Nancy. I think you really touched on some key points there about, the domestic outlook, but also the impacts that this notion of the benevolent dictator of strongmen rulers can have internationally and also in the region. So on that note, Sadali, I'd like to turn to you, because your home country of Ethiopia has, for a long time, up until perhaps recently, really been held aloft in many circles, including in the development world, as a paragon of authoritarian development in Africa. This idea that, as Nancy was unpacking, this idea that political repression can somehow lead or accelerate development outcomes. So a simple question for you, or straightforward rather, not simple to answer, was this true in the case of Ethiopia, or was it just a facade? We'd like to hear your thoughts on
that. Thank you very much, and thanks for having me. It's a good question, because this was something that up until 2015, that many of us were convinced when the idea itself of a benevolent dictator was not really quite well understood in many of us, and it many of us came to realize that democracy, no matter how inefficient it is, was not something that we thought that deeply when we lived in that 27 years under the EPRDF government. And we thought, delivery of service, efficiency, was what was needed to contain dissenting voices. And it did not hit us that well until 2015, when a protest erupted against a government which 3-4 months prior to that has won 99.9 point something percent of the seats in the parliament, and whereby an election were contested by multiple political parties, not only the ruling coalition. And this was probably barely a year or so after Barack Obama visited Ethiopia and has said to us that we have a democratically elected government. So we were not, distinguishing whether we were living under a benevolent dictatorship or an authoritarianism or a democracy or a simply service delivering system, efficient system, until that protest hit us in the face. And the questions that the people came out with, transcended beyond bread and butter on the table. which was also lacking for that matter. And so we came from that system where we were, it was a rude awakening in many ways, because it was increasingly, becoming a centralized authoritarianism. And yes, few in the academics, few in the media, few people, enlightened parts of the society would call it for what it is. It was a complete authoritarianism system. But the government at that time, a bulwark it was for a regional stability in terms of security. The US government spending a lot of money in supporting Ethiopia's adventure in Somalia, for example, in the name of fighting terrorist organizations there, getting all the European Union supporting the government there, as they are doing today as well, save for the last 4 or 5 months, supporting and strengthening the system, because the system was containing this increasingly growing number of people in a country where, what we have seen has happened in Syria, with a country of 22, 23 million people. They were just very much happy to support a centralized authoritarian system in a country that follows a federal system. And so other than the few that were really confronting the system, as I said, in the media, in the academia, that were calling it by what it was, which was a very centralized authoritarianism, the idea that what we had, surpassed even that mark of benevolent dictatorship. And this happened to be not in 2015 when the ruling coalition at that time, the EPRDF, won the 100%. This happened to be in 2005, which was a watershed moment for Ethiopia's journey, if we had a journey until then, to democracy. The 2005 election is for many of us a turning point, and it was after that the government has become increasingly authoritarian. So many of us could reckon with the 2005 election as a turning point for the ruling party at that time to become authoritarian, and then 2015, a complete turn, a completion of that centralized authoritarianism. And so, but through the process, what we have learned is that, yes, democracy is inefficient, but authoritarianism is very painful. And the tricky point that we are at the moment is, having lived through in the beginning, what can pass as a benevolent dictatorship, and then after that went straight into centralized authoritarianism. What we transcended after that in 2018, when the current prime minister came to power, is what turned out to be initially not an authoritarian looking state, but a state that was the anathema of the authoritarianism that we emerged after, because it came with a promise of undoing that centralized authoritarianism. But in the process, because we have lived through that authoritarianism, which was passed as a fairly acceptable, as long as it contained dissenting voices, as long as it did not implode. So the system that promised in undoing that was confronted with the legacy of that authoritarianism, where promises of democratizing, promises of reforming the states and reforming the institutions that the state used was becoming nearly impossible. Because what that authoritarianism did was opening up the Pandora's box, a system that it cannot control on its own once you have unleashed it. And so there is, in the process, what you learn is that benevolent or not, authoritarianism or dictatorship are all the same. Whether they are termed as benevolent or centralized, they unleash a system that states cannot control back once they are put into motion. So the system that we have now under what the world knows as a reformer prime minister, I would disagree with that from the very beginning, is that a prime minister who could not neither establish a separate system from that authoritarianism system, nor control what that authoritarian system has unleashed in terms of weakening institutions, in terms of undermining the state-citizen relationship and making that relationship increasingly moderated through violence, because what we have is now not even that centralized authoritarianism. So this has led us, many of us now, to believe, to compare the bygone era of the EPRDF as the best thing that was there, as compared to what we are going through the last 3 years. The increasing privatization of monopoly on violence that the government could not control in the advent of the collapse of the EPRDF regime, which was under the thumb of the EPRDF, a very strong and efficient security system, which was ready to crush any dissenting, surveillance system, intelligence, very efficient, but very repressive as well. So what we have now is a government that is neither able to replicate what we came through, nor democratize or reform that. And this is exactly because of this, the kind of worms, the system of authoritarianism that we had unleashed. We dismantled the people through their persistent protest into the street, by conquering the streets and saying no to that centralized authoritarianism. People are now craving a return of that. Why? Because it was so difficult to democratize such a deeply entrenched authoritarianism. And also there was lack of commitment from the current system that we have. We ended up dealing with decentralized violence as opposed to centralized authoritarianism. So this all draws its genesis into a system that was disfigured in the very beginning, and that was held as a benevolent, held as a containing and efficient, but deep inside it was a disfigured. It undermines the institutions. The rule of law is invoked when it only suits the system in power. For example, under the EPRDF regime, they would arrest, they would go into crackdown of any dissenting voices, be it journalists, activists, political parties. And the US government or even the EU or the governments that were the enablers of that system couldn't do anything because the state that we had would invoke the rule of law. If you are trying to talk to, crack down on dissenting voices, is not good, and you have to democratize, you have to let loose, you have to let people speak what they feel. The state at that time, because it suits to it, will invoke the rule of law. It is a court matter. It's a court case that is being handled by the judiciary, but it's at the same time, it is the same judiciary that the executive kept on undermining when it suits them. And so we do have now people craving for that kind of system, because what we ended up having is neither a centralized authoritarianism nor a democratized system, but somewhere that falls into a decentralized violence, a state that is now mediating the relationship, the vertical relationship and the horizontal relationship between the state and citizens, and between citizens using the means of violence. And so it is the legacy of coming out of that deeply entrenched and centralized authoritarianism that we ended up today having literally a civil war and a dozen other violence that are really threatening the collapse of the state as we speak today.
Thank you so much, Sedale. And there's something that you mentioned in your submission about the Prime Minister Abiy. Like when he comes in, he's lauded as a reformer to the point where he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize very soon after he came to power. Does this reflect somehow a broader tendency to congratulate new seemingly reformist leaders before they've actually delivered? Is that perhaps part of the problem here? What can Ethiopia teach us in this regard?
Well, the rationale between the rationale among the Nobel Peace Awarding Committee is that the award is given either to something that's accomplished or something that you can look up to, to encourage the people, the awardees, to proceed and the way that the journey that they have started. So in this regard, I guess the Nobel Peace Prize awarding committee gave it to Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed to encourage him, particularly the rapprochement that he launched with Eritrea, a country that we have had a no peace, no war status for 20-something years. But it was very problematic from the very beginning. And, some of us were raising the concern we had, including the magazine that I work for. We've been very critical about the manner in which this Nobel Peace was awarded to the Prime Minister. In that, first of all, the peace agreement that the Prime Minister has allegedly reached with Eritrea was not approved by the parliament. There was no institutionalized mechanism for the Ethiopian people to understand what exactly was it that he has signed or had signed with Eritrea's dictator Isaias Afwerki. And so there was a lot of questions to that regard, and that's exactly the problem. When we came out of that centralized authoritarianism, when everything was institutionalized, including our own private lives and mediated by the state, we jumped from that to a prime minister who was really overlooking every institution. So in the beginning, the rapprochement did not include, for example, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which should have been front and center in terms of Ethiopia's foreign policy, in terms of Ethiopia's relationship with its neighbors and everything. It was a personal relationship between Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed and Isaias Afwerki. The people of Ethiopia did not know what was included in that agreement that they have signed. And we would be proven right now, a year and a half down the line, we have a civil war in Tigray, which involves both men. Today, actually, for the first time, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed admitted that Eritrea crossed over the border to Tigray, which is something that has been proven beyond reasonable doubt in the past. And only today he had accepted it. So it was for many, it's a point of vindication for many people that peace agreement was actually, as Alex Doral often refers to it, it was a security pact between the two. So because we ended up having a war, we ended up the two aligned together in this war against the Tigray regional state government led by the TPLF. And so it was very problematic from the beginning and did not deliver what the world wanted to see. And the other point that the world often refers to Abiy Ahmed as a reformer is that they call him like he has, for example, released thousands of prisoners, which is completely wrong. He came to power in April of 2018. Prisoners in Ethiopia were released in February of 2018. Prisoners were released under the previous regime, actually, and under the previous prime minister that he took over from Hailemariam Desalegn. And it was a collective decision of the EPRDF government, which has now completely collapsed and it does not exist at all. Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, yes, he has taken a few measures, and for example, allowing in political parties that were in exile previously, and revoking some of the statuses of these political parties as terrorist organizations and everything. But here as well, we must, it's something that the world always fails to see, is that many of those political party leaders that returned back under Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed ended up being jailed today. Many of those political organizations are now participating in the election that we will be having come June 5th in the general election. And the prisons have refilled back again, particularly in Oromia regional state. Thousands of people are currently jailed. Many of the opposition parties, the Oromo Federalist Congress and the Oromo Liberation Front, both of them have boycotted the election or been systematically pushed aside to participate from the election. Their leadership and their cadres, their rank and file members are back in prison today. And many of them are in prison for many without due course, without judicial process in there. And those who have even seen the light of the day or seen their days in court, some of them are, released by the judiciary, by the judges, but the police kept on refusing to release them. So what we have today is even a judiciary system that is worse than what we had under the EPRDF. It was very exacerbating at that time to hear a court releasing dissenting, political figures on bail, and the police refusing to release them. We were really barely familiar with that kind of, undermining of the judiciary system by the security apparatus. Today, it has become an everyday occurrence for us. Every day you hear a court has released an opposition party, but the police refused to release them. You could even hear stories about a police handing over their detainees to a different police station. So this is something that we did not live through under the centralized authoritarian system of the EPRDF. So what we have today is not reformed institutions, although there has been a lot of effort, particularly in reforming the judiciary, but a system that is neither able to control nor able to democratize it. So it is somewhere in the mercy of individual police officers. And so you cannot even call this one a benevolent dictatorship. It is an authoritarian state, which is at the mercy of individuals, at the mercy of a police officer, a court being undermined by a single police officer, judges being beaten by police. We hear those stories today. And so this is the kind of transition that we have. And this is, some of it can be traced to the system that we had previously. Democratizing authoritarian systems is never an easy process. But also there are so many wrong turns that were taken by the powers that be today we have in Ethiopia.
Thank you so much, Tsedale. I think, Alicante, I would want you to come into the conversation. We hear a lot about Kagame's autocratic rule in Rwanda, but we hear very little internationally about the many other dictators on the continent. Can you tell us about the experience of Equatorial Guinea and other countries you follow in the region? Does that experience match up to the Rwandan one? What has happened to democracy and development?
So thank you very much for having me. I've learned so much from listening to Nancy and Tsedale. This has been a great conversation already. So to my sisters, Shukran, Amasekinalo, I've learned a lot. In my mind, I think Nancy's presentation laid out clearly why this myth is completely ridiculous, right? And I believe Jeff, in his introductory remarks, alluded to the fact that I believe one of the previous scholars that you had here at one point talked about how this whole concept of benevolent dictator is one that was probably, invented or came up, used during colonial times, certainly a racist theory, a racist proposition to justify economic control, right? To justify slavery and the type of things that we know. So, it is very enlightening to hear all this stuff. I think I come to these issues certainly from a legal perspective, from the perspective of, human rights and rights that, we all entitled to. Equatorial Guinea, is, in my mind, the classic or the textbook case of what a dictatorship is, what an authoritarian kleptocracy really is, right? And unfortunately for me, and unfortunately for us Africans, we have many of those in Africa today, right? I think one thing I gathered from Tsedale's presentation, is that, look, dictatorships are bad. Authoritarianism is bad. There is no such thing as benevolent dictators, right? So if you want to think of an analogy, think of an analogy of an iron fist in a velvet glove. It's still an iron fist. It can still kill you if he strikes you. And that is the reality in Equatorial Guinea, where powers have been centralized by the Obiang family for the last 44 years. And in fact, since independence, because it was his uncle following independence, Macias, he deposed his uncle and took over in 79, and he's been there since. And his son, who is the vice president, who controls the military that commits all the atrocities that happen in Equatorial Guinea today, you know, the torture and the disappearing and the kidnapping, etc., is poised to become the next president. When I look at Equatorial Guinea, I see very, very little difference with what's happening in Rwanda, what was happening in Eritrea, what's happening. And in fact, if you look at the ranking at Freedom House, you realize that, you know, Equatorial Guinea is right there with North Korea and Turkmenistan and Eritrea and South Sudan. And that is because, you know, we're talking about countries where fundamentally freedoms, civil liberties are denied, right? So I want to limit my, I want to be short because I want us to have time to take questions and stuff. I mean, I think the question we should be asking ourselves, and the question I would like most Africans to be asking as we think about these issues of what sort of government we want, is not what government can best rule, what government can best give us road and the things that we need, right? I think the question we need to be answering, you know, is what systems, what is the type of government that prevents the worst type of rules in Africa? All right, I think that is the fundamental question. And when we ask that question, and when we look at agreements, including things like, you know, the Charter on Democracy and Elections and Governance that most African governments have signed, there is absolutely no doubt in my mind that most Africans would agree that we want democratically elected rulers in Africa.
Thank you so much, Tutu, my friends. We're actually at that time where we typically turn it over for our question and answer. But Tutu, if you could, in 30 seconds, I'd really love to ask you this question because I know it's something you care deeply about. You were discussing the iron fist and a velvet glove issue. And one of the issues I know that you've talked and you've written frequently about is the role of private Western firms, PR and lobby firms, namely in helping to create this myth of the benevolent strongman, portraying them as stable, enduring partners with whom to do business. So if you could, in 1 minute, I know it's a difficult task, tell us about this industry. Do these partners actually help to drive development in Equatorial Guinea or elsewhere? For example, are they partners in progress, or as they like to claim, or are they merely tools of the dictator and his personal whims? If you could, for 1 minute, really outline that for us.
So, and Jeff, I hope, you know, you will be encouraging the audience here to tune in tomorrow. I'll be speaking in Congress tomorrow at the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission, and speaking precisely about this issue, right, of the enablers, the Western enablers. Right. I think so I was in Congress in 2010 when lawyers and bankers and real estate agents, they have helped Theodore Rain bring into the US hundreds of millions of dollars to then purchase the Malibu mansion and all these different things, play the fifth and walk out, right? And these are the same people, the Lanny Davises of the world, the Corvis and Associates, the Cassidy and Associates, all these different firms, all these PR firms, are the ones that are putting out the multi-million-dollar videos and articles on New York Times and all these places claiming that Paul Kagame, Teodoro Obiang, Denis Sassou Nguesso are benevolent dictators, or are, the way they frame it actually, are great promoters of democracy, promoters, you know. So there is no doubt in my mind that, you know, these Western enablers are perpetuating that myth of the benevolent dictator. Yes.
Thank you, Tutu. Appreciate that. And thank you, Nancy and Sadali, again. Now let's turn this discussion over to my colleague, Nick Cheeseman, and today's discussant, Brian Klaas, to get their thoughts on these topics, and also to check in on our WhatsApp channel to see what questions we've received for today's speakers. So Nick, I'm passing the mic to you.
Thanks, everyone. Great discussion already. Because we've got Brian here and he's written books on this, not just in sub-Saharan Africa, but looking more globally. And of course, this is not an African issue. This extends well beyond Africa's borders. I'm just going to pitch it over to Brian to give us his thoughts. And then I've got 3 great questions, which have come in from our audience who've been very vocal today. And I'll be putting those to our speakers before we wrap up. So over to Brian and then the Q&A. Brian, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, and apologies if there's any noise in the background. I have a young puppy in my house. So I just wanted to start with one aspect of the big picture here that comes through in the comments we've heard today, and thank you for having me along such esteemed speakers. The first thing is that when it comes down to democracy versus authoritarianism, there's one big principle that I can't shake away, which is People deserve to have a say in decisions that affect their lives, no matter where they live on the planet. That is the fundamental issue at stake here. And that can be robbed in two ways. It can be robbed by dictators, but it can also be robbed by what Nick and I have called counterfeit democracy, fake democracy, democracy that's done badly, that holds rigged elections, but doesn't have any of the institutions behind it, or as Nancy has outlined, doesn't have state capacity to be able to actually solve problems. And without real democracy, you're never going to have the fruits of that system. And so you create this false comparison, which is what has created this long-standing divide between democracy and authoritarianism, especially in Africa, where there are many rigged elections that take place, and they're labeled and sometimes accepted by their populations as the thing itself, when they are in fact counterfeit democracies. Genuine democracies on the continent are thriving. And I think one of the things that we need to make sure is we don't make the mistake of comparing the wrong categories. We don't compare counterfeit democracy with developmental authoritarian states. So that's the first point. The next thing that I'd say is there's another principle that I think cannot be argued away when it comes to this question. And that is the aspect of, if you have a dictator in place, if they start off benevolent, they usually turn nasty. And at that point, it's too late to replace them. And you may be happy with the dictator that you have in your country now, but you have to imagine the thought experiment of, what if your worst enemy, the person you think is the worst for the country, takes power? Will you accept that they have absolute control and you have no voice for the foreseeable future? Democracies, when they are done properly, have a safety valve that allows a self-correction mechanism so that you can end up replacing people when the government turns bad. Benevolent dictators, quote unquote, do not have that. And when they inevitably do turn bad, then it's too late. The damage is already done, and you have no systemic way to go against them. Now, I think this debate stalls, as I said, because of this false comparison that gets made. And I'll use an analogy that I think works well here. Imagine that you have a baker who says, I'm going to serve you the most delicious cake you've ever had, right? And when you get to your plate, there's just a pile of flour sitting on it. And you eat it and it tastes disgusting. Well, elections are like the flour. Elections are part of democracy, but they are not the cake. They're not the finished product. And what a lot of times is happening when we have this debate is you are comparing the flour to some sort of seemingly delicious dessert at the moment that is actually laced with poison. And so I think what's happening in this debate is you have a series of, at times, flawed democracies, counterfeit democracies that are being compared to the very best of authoritarian states, while neglecting all the authoritarian states that are rife with conflict and violence and disastrous economic destruction. And so I think we don't need to cherry pick examples. We shouldn't take the best example of authoritarianism. We should take the average example of authoritarianism. And when you take the actual average of democratic states, real democracies around the world, they outperform dictatorships immensely, right? And so I think this is something that we have to be very cognizant of. But at the end of the day, the real two reasons that I think are most important here. One, I think it's impossible to make the case. I have never been persuaded by someone who says nobody has the right to influence decisions that profoundly affect their life chances. I think that's a fundamental human right, no matter where you are, and dictatorships rob people of that right, as do counterfeit democracies. And the second issue is, if you believe you have a benevolent dictator, just wait long enough. I promise you it will turn bad. And at that point, the system is the one where you want the replaceability to be possible. So at the end of the day, I think that's the fundamental aspect here that we need to keep in mind. And you can cherry pick points in time where one authoritarian regime seems better than a flawed democracy. But the ultimate verdict, I think, that history will render is that sticking with democracy, true democracy, is the only way to yield long-lasting, sustainable dividends for Africa and indeed for the rest of the world.
Thanks, Brian. Great comments. I like that point about trying to compare the averages rather than the exceptional performances, and trying not to compare what are effectively flawed democracies and are not really actually including and entrenching that principle of accountability. Good food for thought. Now, our speakers, you're very welcome to respond to that, but I've got a really great question for each of you that come from our audience around the world, and they're not easy questions. So, but I'm going to direct one to each of you, because otherwise we're going to run out of time, and I'm going to ask you to respond in just a minute if you can. So really focus the answer. So first of all, to Nancy, this is a question that's come in from Canada and Uganda, people watching in those countries. And they're saying, look, we accept what you're saying. We accept some of this criticism of authoritarian rule, but how do we reconcile what you are telling us and some of the other people on the panel with the apparent mass popularity of leaders like Paul Kagame in Rwanda, and the sights of thousands of Tanzanians running towards the coffin of John Magufuli? How do we reconcile that public apparent popularity with the criticism that we're hearing on the panel? So that's for you, Nancy. Tadele, we're coming to you over a question from Somalia and Kenya. The question here is, would the authoritarian success stories that we often hear about, and I think here they're thinking about Rwanda, Ethiopia, etc., would they have been as successful if it wasn't for the vast amounts of foreign aid that has at times been channeled to them by foreign governments? So would they have had the success that they're lauded for internationally if they hadn't had the support of foreign governments through foreign aid? Finally, a quick question for you, Tutu, coming to you. And this comes from people in South Africa and the United States who fed in different versions of this question. And they say, is there a risk that outside criticism of authoritarian rule, they might be thinking of those of us on the Resistance Bureau, is there a risk that that criticism allows strong men to mobilize support by claiming to be defending national sovereignty against different forms of Western interference? And if that's true, how do you suggest that people who are critical of authoritarian rule respond? So we'll go in that order, starting with Nancy. Please unmute yourself, Nancy.
Thanks, Nick. This is an excellent question, and whoever wrote it is spot on, because it was phrased as the apparent popularity. And that's the key point, because we need to differentiate between populism and popularity. First of all, as classically in all dictatorship, I mean, the control of the narrative, the control of the press, the control of freedom of expression is key to the survival of those dictators. And it's actually, it's not accurate to say like what we see or what we hear is just a reflection of the will of the people, or at least the majority of the people. First of all, let's take the cause, because the press is stifled, freedom of expression is restricted, and people who are dissidents are thrown in jail. So in that respect, from the causal side, it is very difficult to say accurately that this is a reflection of the will of all the people. But also on the side of the policies, I mean, if it is really a popular and demanded and favored kind of leadership, why would we see that classically, again, all dictators work on changing the laws and the constitution to extend their terms? I mean, if they are confident as that everyone is just like hailing their progress, I mean, we've seen this in Rwanda in 2015, we've seen it in Egypt in 2019, basically actually both extending their term to stay over like in 2034 or 32. And that's a reflection of the lack of confidence of the material delivery of the needs and the civic rights of the people, not just the dominance of a narrative. And you also see with those dictators that also rely on the grand projects that have long-term effects. So it is always about building a new city or infrastructure that includes like big dams or bridges. And what's significant about this, and what's like really critical for those dictators, is that they are always seen as like project that will reap, we're all going to reap the fruits of that effort later on in the long term. And that's why right now we have to swallow whatever repressive regimes are going on. The other part of this is the issue of collateral damage. The idea of, yes, some what we call benevolent dictators admit that there are some violations of human rights, that some people are thrown in jail, that some freedom of the press is sort of stifled, and justify that because we are in transition, and that is actually a way in order to reach the bigger goal for the better sort of resources and sort of if it's like better state of the country. But the idea of collateral damage is actually is a ridiculous idea. Is like there are like some citizens who are not just having the same rights as the rest. Is like sort of we can like if we flip Amartya Sen's the deserving and undeserving poor, it's like there is the deserving and undeserving citizens. Like there are ones who have to be the collateral damage for the better good of the others, and who decides that? And just to like a last point, because this is going to be my final remark, why is the benevolent dictator, even if they are performing better at the outside of the Rhine, they cannot sustain that forever? It's because of the ecosystem of dictatorship. And it works exactly the opposite of the checks and balances of democracy, where within the dictatorship, the institutions who are working to support the presidency, to support the regime, are acting in a way of survival and self-preservation, where they are posing for the head of the regime as they are essential for his survival. And in that sense, I mean, like if we're talking about the judiciary, they will pose for the regime as the most important aspect to legitimize the kind of actions they're taking. If we're looking at parliaments, and like again, like who would be just like really charade parliaments, they are justifying what the president is saying. And then again, like worst is security apparatus, like they actually become even more brutal to show and pose for the regime that we are important because we are keeping away the mob from attacking you. So the ecosystem of dictatorship dictates that things actually go into an unfair, unjust, and unstable direction, as opposed to the idea of checks and balances, the idea of the rotation of leadership through free and fair elections. And again, like the core of the issue of when people project this popularity, it should not be confused. First of all, it should not be confused as an authentic reflection or a fair reflection, and it should not be confused with populism. It's exactly the same as saying like Trump was like it was a popular leader, whereas like we see the difference between his populism and what was actually happening on the ground. Like when he goes on national TV or like on like nationally say that they are going on track for combating COVID-19, where actually 500,000 people have died, and all the atrocities that we've seen around the country happening because of that, and the death of like the high rate of like the sort of the Black community being harmed more than the rest. All this is a sign to show that there's a difference between popularity and populism, and the issue of the collateral damage, those who could suffer for the good of the better and the best, and the ecosystem of dictatorship that actually definitely and without doubt leads to a direction with failure, instability, and injustice. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nancy. Sadali, I think the next question was to you, just to sum it up really quickly. This came in from some viewers from Somalia and Kenya and other places across East Africa, interestingly, about authoritarian success stories being buffeted by the vast amounts of foreign aid that have come in. I know you mentioned the $1.3 billion in annual security assistance, for instance, that has gone to Ethiopia. So it would be really great to hear your thoughts on that.
Sorry, Jeffrey. So that was Nancy's, the $1.3 billion annual security assistance, the US to Egypt. But Ethiopia receives a good amount of money as well, which I don't have the figures at the moment. The simple answer to this question is no. Authoritarian systems cannot be sustained without the support from the West. But there is no binary to this. It's a bit deceptive if we just really corner this into a yes and no explanation. Yes, it is necessary that countries coming out of, for example, my own country, Ethiopia, was in 1991 coming out of a 17-year civil war and a very brutal dictatorship, the Derg, that oversaw the killing of hundreds of thousands of people and a famine, and the country was completely on the verge of collapse. And so when the EPRDF government at that time came into power, it was understandable that the West, provided that they do some corrective measures in their ideological stance, the West was chipping in to support the country stand on its own feet. And to a certain extent, this is justifiable, this is agreeable. But then comes the time when you have to question for whom is the West supporting a given government in place, who really benefits from that. And sometimes it takes an absolute shocker for the West to withhold their largesse to authoritarian governments that are really not even accepted or don't have legitimacy in the eyes of their own population. This rude awakening came in Ethiopia in 2005 election, when I think it was led by the UK government that abruptly cut short its direct budget support to the then government led by the late Prime Minister Meles Zenawi. It was around £60 million support that the UK government was about to channel directly to the government at that time. We're seeing the same thing today. In 2005, it was because of the post-election violence that has seen the killing of nearly 200 protesters on the street by the security, and the arrest of thousands and thousands, up to 80,000 people, dissenters from the streets. And so this was sort of like a rude awakening for the West that was up until then supporting the government to stand on its own feet. And so they withheld it at that time. And our rude awakening under the leadership of Abiy Ahmed came now in the last 4 or 5 months after the war in Tigray. I think the European Union became the first institution that has directly cut the support of about $110 million US. But as I said, there is no binary to that, because the European Union still is the largest financier, for example, of the upcoming Ethiopian election, in which opposition parties are not participating, and a very few exclusive club of parties are going to take part. And many sane-minded people would see that election as a recipe for disaster. So this funding that the European Union countries have made available through the UNDP to finance this election is not going to be attached to anything. So as we stand today, this election is going to go ahead despite several red signs, between be it the Afar Somali regional states. There is something to watch over there. Oromia, as I say, the largest constituent unit of the federation, is literally not being represented by any opposition party other than the ruling party, which is quite infamous, to speak truth. But this election is going ahead, and this election is being financed to the tune of 50 million or above euros, financed by the European Union countries, by the countries in the European Union. And so, as I say, there is no binary to that. But it's very important to pause and ask, for whom is this support going to be? As long as they don't really are hit in the face they will go on financing, whether that government is an authoritarian state, whether that government, because the most important thing is that that so-called government contains the populace down there. And for them, it's very important that there are no millions of people migrating, because Europe will be the first doorstep for Ethiopians if we start spilling over. And so as long as, they are kept and contained there, the European Union will go on. So the rude awakening for Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed became now what happened in Tigray, when he refused allowing the media, when they still and refused humanitarian access, and the war did not stop. So they try to put strings attached to their financial support. Other than that, they will go on supporting unless there is this big bang in the face that really comes and hits them quite hard.
Thank you so much, Sadali. I know, Brian, you have to leave us very shortly here, but I wanted to give you the opportunity if you had any parting thoughts or parting shots for any of us before you depart.
Yeah, I think the one of the big things that is a sticking point in this debate is that there is an aspect of this that is people like me in the West saying democracy is good for Africa. And I think that it's important to be aware that democracy is a work in progress everywhere. I'm from the United States, which has showcased the world for the last 4 years how fraught and damaged that democratic system is. But I'm very glad that we have a system of government that allows self-correction. And so I think that for those who believe that criticisms of African authoritarianism from someone like me smacks of neocolonialism or neo-imperialism, it's not that I'm trying to say, here's how you should run your government. It's that I'm trying to say, I want you to have a say in how you run your government. And I want you to have the ability to fix problems when problems develop in who's in charge. And that's what democracy is all about. It's not about imposing a system of government on others. It's about saying, in order to have the ability to shape decisions that affect your life chances, benevolent dictatorships do not offer that, partly because there's a myth that the benevolent dictatorship is possible, and partly because human history has shown that even the best dictatorships turn bad eventually. So, my points here are not to be prescriptive of what should happen in Africa. It's to say that for Africans to dictate their own future, they should have a voice that is not taken away by those who claim to be benevolent dictators.
Well put, Brian. Thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it. Keep up the great work, and we'll certainly be following what you do next. Thanks again. And that's actually a really great segue to the question we received for you from the audience. Namely, is there a risk that outside criticism, perceived or otherwise, of authoritarian rule in Africa by folks who look like me, for instance, does this allow strongmen to mobilize support by claiming to be defending national sovereignty, by claiming to be defenders of Pan-Africanism against outside interference? We often see that. How do you respond to that, and what are your thoughts on that before we close today's show and we kick it back to Mintade?
Yes, well, thank you, Jeff. Thank you, and I want to thank all my colleagues, including Brian. I am African. I might not look like one, but I am African. I am from Equatorial Guinea, and every single day I get threats and criticism from my own government because of my work. So that's not a criticism they level against just guys that look like you, Jeff. And I get criticism, and I have received, in preparation to this conversation, a lot of the trolls and people that are there thinking that what you're doing is neo-colonialism have attacked me and have attacked my African colleagues over here. I think it's important for us to recognize that too many of us Africans are still suffering from trauma of having been colonized, trauma of having been enslaved, right? And because of that, there are certain things that we should be able to work on. We should be able to walk and chew gum, and we're not doing, because we're still very, very traumatized. And when someone like you come and is trying to help us figure out certain things, we attack you. I want to answer the question so we can all get out of here. Nancy clearly and beautifully alluded to the fact that, we have to understand that these people that are perceived as strong men are anything but strong. And we have to understand that. And if we understand that, then the answer over here as to whether there is a risk, there is absolutely no risk. There is a fact. And that fact was proven here on January 6th, and it's been proven over the last 4 years when we have the other guy here in the US use criticism, use media, use anything that will come at him, talking about his penchant for authoritarianism, use that to call for let's make America great again, America is under siege, all these different things, and almost got away with overthrowing elections over here, right? There is a need for us, all of us, Africans and people around the world, to work on those issues. Martin Luther King once said, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. When there is an injustice, and in my opinion, denying someone the right to choose their own leader is an injustice. When there's an injustice anywhere, that constitutes a threat to democracy or to justice everywhere. So all of us, you know what, because the end of the question is, what can we do? We should be working to build solidarity networks that ensures that dictators do not get away with the things that they get away with in Africa, to ensure that, you know, you do not have an Obiang or a Paul Kagame or Museveni as the chair of the African Union, to ensure that, you know, when Abiy Ahmed receives the Nobel Peace Prize, there is enough Africans, not just Ethiopians, Africans all over, saying these are not the leaders that represent Africa. There has to be more solidarity among us to ensure that, you know, we're building institutions, we're building a united Africa, an African Union that is not a union of dictators, but a union of the people. That is the direction we have to be going in. You know, yes, I am a lawyer and I've worked a lot as a lawyer, but before that, you know, I used to work as an organizer working with farm workers, right? And we have to organize. We have to organize our people. Taking people to Tahrir Square is the work of organizing. You know, and we have to do that in many African countries. The things that are happening now in Dakar, the things that are happening all across Africa, in Congo, Brazzaville right now, require us to be organizing, to be working together to ensure that, you know, dictators, eventually all of them, end up with Obiang and Jam in Equatorial Guinea instead of where they are right now. That's a joke.
Thanks, Tutu, and thanks everyone for your brilliant commentary. We're very short on time, so we're about to conclude. Mantade, my trusty co-host, back over to you to send us off.
Thank you so much, Jeff. I think this was a very powerful engagement. Thank you so much to our viewers for tuning in, and thank you so much to our brilliant panel, and to Brian Klaas and Absentia as well for joining us. Our entire team looks forward to keeping in touch with all of you and to tracking the work that you're doing, as well as just highlighting some of the work that you'll be doing moving forward. In the meantime, you can also keep up to date with the Resistance Bureau by visiting our website, www.theresistancebureau.com, and also just by subscribing to our YouTube channel and following us on social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram as the Resistance Bureau. We really hope that you continue to join us in those important discussions as we continue to bring to the table some of Africa's most brilliant and dynamic thought leaders. As a final note as well, I just want to say that putting this show together would not be possible if it wasn't for the teamwork that continues to bring it to life. Thank you so much to our advisory council, and a special shout out to our colleagues, Peter Dory and Dondon Saga, for working hard behind the scenes to make this show a success. And for myself, Mandat Mloja, my co-host, Jeffrey Smith, thank you so much for joining us today. Be safe out there, keep fighting the good fight, and we will see you on our next program. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.